Ms. Shirley Gale Sinclair. And again, thank you to all our panelists in this panel session 7, if we can give them a round of applause. I won't attempt to summarize, but just to give what I want to call some one-liners from each of our presenters, just to set the stage for the discussion period. We were meant to end at 2:58, but we started a little after time, a little later than scheduled. So I think we can try to recapture that 10 minutes or so in terms of the discussion. Godfrey St. Bernard, I think there was a cross-cutting theme among the 4 panelists in that we were trying to locate their various perspectives in the context of Caribbean economies. And Godfrey St. Bernard started the ball rolling by effectively saying that there is a need for social planning. And my apologies if I paraphrase, sometimes a little off the straight and narrow path. But Godfrey St. Bernard started by telling us that we needed to effectively engage in social planning because some of our challenges that we're trying to address now are intergenerational in nature. And if we understood future populations and future population dynamics, it could help us sort of anticipate and address ex ante some of the challenges that we might face based on the population dynamics. He spoke, of course, in closing about policy considerations such as things like our aging populations, international migration, trends, etc., etc. Mark Figueroa actually used mathematical inequalities to trigger our thoughts on how we make investment decisions, foreign investment decisions versus national investment decisions, how we deplete our non-renewable resources as opposed to having alternative investments to compensate for those depletion of non-renewable resources, and effectively how not ensuring or not looking at those inequalities can have a deleterious impact on our development trajectory. Citing the work, of course, of people like Lewis and Gervin, Al Francis, our fallen comrade from the Mona campus of blessed memory, and of course Dennis Panton, in whose honor we have the conference this year. Malini Maraj effectively left the message that while there are a number of indices and indicators out there that purport to look at development, instead of getting excited when any one of these things come out, excited in a good way or in a bad way, we really need to step back and identify what are some of the indigenous indicators that we ought to have to effectively steer us along a path or steer us in a direction that we can truly identify that we are achieving the development objectives that we want to have, effectively calling for us to have some indigenous indicators, or certainly retrofitting the indicators that are out there to reflect our specific sets of circumstances. And then, of course, Shirley Gale Sinclair, looking at the issue of procurement, but looking at the issue, one of the takeaways from her presentation is looking at the issue of procurement and the need for governance in our procurement system, because as she represented in one of her graphs, much of the funding for procurement is our taxpayers' dollars, and we really ought to ensure that while procurement is generally left at the government level, the public sector, so to speak, that we ensure that there is some level of accountability. There were other messages there in terms of the size of the CARICOM market, etc., and the opportunities there are for us to capitalize on that size instead of seeing ourselves as small. But one of the takeaways really is to look at the need for governance in procurement, particularly where it is government, self-financed procurement, and greater opportunities for mismanagement, but as we say in local parlance, great opportunities for corruption. All right, so on that note, I would like to open the floor for questions and discussions, questions posed to our panelists. And we'll take a round of questions, so if I can identify the first 3. We have Myrna, and I like the fact that we have students.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My question is to Dr. St. Bernard. Okay, so, the Bible talked about God making man and the story of Adam and Eve, a story that I firmly believe in. And so far, things have been going along that particular part very well. But I don't know, there are some people who support another part. And in your policy recommendations or your policy implications, I was wondering if at all you thought that this recent trend of those who, as they put it, coming out of the closet or something like that, whether that has any bearing on population. I want to ask you frankly whether you think it is a means to control population. And if it is not a means to control population, how do you factor that into your, or have you factored it into your research? And if not, how can it be factored in? I don't know what year that your research represented, but I'd certainly like to get your take on that. And for Malini, I would simply like to know what are the ingredients of the Social Progress Index? What do they put into the mix to come up with that? Yeah, thank you.
All right. Iran and then Tabone, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, good day. Thank you very much for a very informative panel. The first one is about procurement policy, very quick. The commission inquiry that came out of COTE, the whole corruption fiasco there, painted some very grim realities for our society. But one of the things that they showed was, in fact, policy-wise, we do have fairly stable procurement policies. The practice of those policies is a whole different question. So that's sort of what I'm asking about. In 2012, the World Bank made a ruling against SNC-Lavalin and put them on a blacklist for bidding against World Bank contracts. And within 6 months from that, SNC-Lavalin was given a no-bid contract by the governor of Trinidad and Tobago to build a penile hospital, which fortunately there were some people who were aware of it and raised some noise. How that contract got facilitated was through a Canadian state entity called the Canadian Commercial Corporation that exists for the design purpose of helping Canadian private corporations get around developing countries' effective procurement policies. So just a few comments on that. The next one is that the International Development Bank earlier this year released a report called Is There Caribbean Sclerosis? And in that report, they identified two statistics that I'm going to highlight here. And they said that 60% of people who complete secondary education in the Caribbean migrate, and that 70% of the people who complete tertiary education migrate. So I guess in terms of the demographics and this sort of stuff, do you have any particular comments as to how we might address the intergenerational ramifications of these consequences?
And then no, Sinclair. It's a joint paper. Gail Sinclair.
Miss Gail Sinclair. So, in your presentation, you mentioned the CARICOM, the region of CARICOM, when you combine them, they have this great potential, but because of fragmentation and politics and all that jazz, it's not happening. And I'm taking it from the stance of Calypso. A lot of Calypsonians were singing about CARIFTA, CARIFORM Federation, and Black Stalin in his Calypso, Cry of the Caribbean, mentioned that CARIFORM, which is like, you could say just like a spin-off, or the precursor, sorry, to CARICOM, and then CSME is dead. My question is, how do you suggest CSME, which in my view is dead, more or less, to provide this procurement service if it's not existent? For example, I'm making reference to the CARIFORM EPA agreement that basically just strangled it and killed it. So how, if something is dead, how is it going to serve a function?
All right, I put the floor to the panelists. Godfrey, I don't know if you wish to begin. Mm-hmm.
Okay, to address the question, I think first of all, what I attempted to do was to look at population dynamics really beginning from about the end of the first decade of the 21st century, because here's where we are at this point in time. And while several countries have done population projections, I stuck specifically to the population projections done by the United Nations, and worked with the medium assumption, which I thought was the most reasonable one. If it is one thing we are sure about, irrespective of your perspective on life, I think, if we are looking at population change, there are three main components: fertility, mortality, migration. Countries are definitely experiencing subtle improvements in their mortality experience. Fertility is generally declining. That's a fact. Although one might say that if you were to take a class analysis of fertility, you might find that in some subclasses, fertility is not declining as fast or declining at all. And I think, when we start looking at population dynamics, we could actually have a nightmarish situation facing us, bearing in mind that population sizes are going to be declining, but perhaps you might be having larger numbers of children being born into settings where perhaps the families might not be capable of taking care of those children and looking after their well-being if the state cannot step in and take charge in terms of ensuring that these children can go to school, they have sufficient food and so on to eat and those kinds of things. So what I'm advocating really is, to take that proactive position at this point in time and anticipate these kinds of changes, because the actors and the beneficiaries 10 years from now, some of them are already alive, and we need to situate ourselves in terms of understanding where they are at now and what we need to do in order to improve their lot and to improve the lot of humankind and institutions and communities where they may reside. So I think, that's my interpretation of what you asked. I don't know if I got the gist of it correctly. There was a statement about demographics. I'm not sure I got the full gist of it, so I don't know if you can repeat it.
So I was asking you about the comments that you had on the intergenerational effects of 60 to 70% of educated people in the Caribbean leaving. What are the intergenerational consequences, and what sort of policy things can we think of, or are there ways that we can actually measure the ramifications of this phenomenon?
Okay. In terms of intergenerational migration and the effects of those with tertiary education leaving, again, I think in the final analysis, when you look at the future, out-migration in terms of emigration is not likely to persist, as it were, given the dynamics that are taking place internationally. And I think it has to be a situation where in Caribbean societies, for us to really survive as small states, we have to find ways and means of retaining our populations in the region. And it may mean that we have to, as I have been saying in the paper, provide means through education and other ways of building resilience and human capital. We have to really invest heavily in that, especially since we're going to be having smaller and smaller cohorts of children and youth coming of age. The monies we spent in terms of putting down the physical plant that we have put down, we will have more than enough physical plant to serve the needs of upcoming generations. What we have to do is to think carefully of how we're going to manage our resources to maximize the efficiency that we attain by way of how we train and prepare them to take on the roles of managing and securing our well-being in years to come. And if we do that, then I think, this trust toward, losing populations, that might be a thing of the past. But it depends on how we act and how we act now.
Thank you, Godfrey. I think there was another question posed to, there was a question posed to Malini. Yeah?
Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Before I address the question that Myrna posed on the Social Progress Index, I just also want to mention a role for managing or maximizing the returns from our diaspora as a possible way of dealing with the migration. Given that, remittances play a significant role in our Caribbean region and contributing to the welfare of many families in the Caribbean region, we may look at how we can maximize on the on the impact of migration by considering remittances and how remittance flows can be directed to productive activities as well. So that's a possible way of exploring the diaspora as an asset as it relates to the demographic changes. With regard to the Social Progress Index, it is based on 3 main dimensions: basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. And under basic human needs, they identify nutrition and basic medical care, water and sanitation, shelter, and personal safety. Under foundations of well-being, they identify access to basic knowledge, access to information and communications, health and wellness, and ecosystem sustainability. And under opportunity, they look at personal rights, personal freedoms and choice, tolerance and inclusion, and access to advanced education. For each of these, they rely on some 54 indicators now to reflect. So for example, for water and sanitation, they would consider access to drinking water, and among other indicators to measure that dimension. For access to basic knowledge, for example, they would rely on enrollment ratios or literacy rates. So a combination of 54 indicators inform the measurement of these dimensions.
Okay, so in respect to your comment regarding implementation, because that's really the issue. Yes, in many cases, you will find that there are instruments, there is documentation, but our big shortcoming within the Caribbean region, within CARICOM, has been implementation, and the whole CARICOM movement is a living example of that. Guyana, for example, was the first country to actually pass a comprehensive public procurement law. That happened, I think, back in about 2001. But to date, it is not operational. It has not been implemented. So that is a big deficiency on our part. With respect to the comment on, well, it's really blacklisting, it's called in our business, and SNC leveling. That kind of thing happens. And many times a firm may be blacklisted by the World Bank, for example, but still end up getting a contract in the country, sometimes where the very violation occurred. Now that led all the multilateral agencies, the IDB, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and all these types to come to what they call a cross-debarment agreement. Because what would happen, the World Bank would blacklist a firm, and then the same firm would go and pick up a contract in the very country because that contract was funded by another lending agency. So this cross-debarment agreement operates in a way that if you are banned by one, then the others will also pick up the ban. So it is intended to hurt the firms in their pockets. But it does not affect the government's ability, right? Because it's a sovereign state. So the government has the right to enter into a bilateral with another country, right? Which I think is what happened in the case you cited. That was a government-to-government agreement between the two countries. And under the auspices of that firm again was brought in. It's a big reputational risk for the government, but as we know, in our experience, we've seen governments can somehow weather these storms, right? So that kind of thing happens. To respond to the second comment, I have to say that I don't share your lack of sanguine, recognition of the role that CARICOM can play. But I think the comment that you have made as a young man and representing the future of this region points to exactly what is wrong and what has been wrong with this process. The thing is, and that's an observation we make in the paper, that the whole CARICOM movement and what evolved into the CSME, which is supposed to deepen this integration further, it has not been properly sold to the people of this region. And it really should have been a bottom-up movement. The people should have been widely educated, widely canvassed about what this means, so that all of us could put our collective weight behind it and bring pressure to bear on our governments to implement this thing, because it is ultimately for all our benefits. So you are feeling very disaffected about this whole process, and you think it's dead. I am more hopeful, but the very reason you feel this way is because you have not been really, included and incorporated in the right way. By way of correction, CARIFORUM is really an alliance between CARICOM and the Dominican Republic. And the Dominican Republic, many people may know, has been trying to join CARICOM for the longest while. And out of fear, which I think is a very myopic view, we have been blocking them. But we formed this alliance with the Dominican Republic to negotiate with the European Commission, that agreement to which you referred, the European Partnership Agreement. And I believe that the DR must have seen that there was going to be some benefit to them to join with CARICOM to negotiate this agreement. And they further went on to negotiate through this forum with Canada. So I'm saying I don't share your view. I think that there is, and I really wish that I had the time to develop the presentation in the right way, but time didn't permit. But what I want us to see is that what we have here, we have a framework for collaboration, we have a framework for integration, and what we need to understand is that we will never be as economically powerful and strong individually as we can be collectively. And with all the issues that are arising now in the European Union, nevertheless, the objectives were similar, right? That together they can form a more united front, and even the weakest among them would be able to benefit, right, under the auspices of that community. So this is the hope that we still have for CARICOM, and I hope that that your views will change, because I believe now that you people like you will have to take up the mantle.
Okay, thank you very much. I want again to thank the panelists. We're going to end this panel here, but the questions can actually spill over into what is going to be the last session, where we're going to have a conversation on the future direction for Caribbean economy. So some of the issues or some of the questions that you may have had to pose to the panelists, we hope that you will hold on to them. And as the discussion, as the conversation evolves in session 8, feel free to pose those questions, because the panelists are still going to be with us for the last session. They're going to be parts of the members of the audience. But we want to start the last session, which now effectively looks at a conversation to bring all of the myriad issues that we've been discussing over the last 2 days, bring them together and identify what could be that path of convergence for Caribbean economies going forward. And added to that, what effectively it could be the role. I think the last panelist, Ms. Gail Sinclair, said that effectively institutions such as ours, University of the West Indies, and I bring that even closer to home, the Department of Economics, we really can be catalytic in that process in partnering with civil society to help us deal with some of these challenges that we keep repeating time and time again. So I want to again thank our 4 panelists, Ms. Gail Sinclair, Malini Maharaj, Professor Figueroa, and Dr. St. Bernard, for their insights on Caribbean economics and economies, and invite the panelists for the last session. Professor Figueroa doesn't need to leave. Professor Emerita Carrie Levitt and Dr. Ralph Henry to join us